Hello, back again with a review of another Redwall book. I've been rereading the series and this time reading them in the publishing order as opposed to in the chronological order that I read them in as a kid. So the fourth Redwall book that Brian Jacques ever wrote is this one, Mariel of Redwall. And this book kind of feels like a soft reboot for the series. So unlike books 2 and 3 that had pretty clear connections to the
first book,
Book 4, its connections to the previous Redwall universe are pretty minimal. It is a prequel, but really only on one or two tiny details. Otherwise, it's set in this weird generation in between the times of Matthias, the hero of the first book, and Martin, the ancient warrior that Matthias looks up to. Now, because book 4 is the first book that does not have a really strong relationship to the previous books, you could say it is the first book in this really long series. I believe there are 22 Redwall books in total, where the series starts to get really repetitive and where maybe one can begin to make the accusations that Brian Jacques was phoning it in and just repeating a formula. I might get to a point where I really feel that way, but I think there are some important good things to say about Mariel of Redwall. So the way I experience the characters in this book, it's kind of like the experience of jumping, if you're a Pokemon fan, from the Generation 1 games to the Generation 5 games. Yes, all of the characters in this book have a pretty clear equivalent figure in the early books, but they're also presented in sharper resolution. So instead of Constance the Badger, we have Melis the Badger. Instead of Basil the Hare, we have Tarquin. Instead of Ambrose Spike, we have Gabriel Quill. Instead of wise old Methuselah, there's blind and wise old Simeon. So because I'm reading in publication order rather than in chronological order, I feel like I'm actually witnessing the development of Brian Jacques as a writer. So reading these characters, they just feel like better written characters. There are also little cool things as a fan you realize when you reread the series. Firstly, this is the first book where they use the term Dibbons. Doesn't mean much, it's just the little term they mean for baby creatures in the Redwall universe. It's one of those cute little inventions. I also believe it is the first book in which they mention the concept of blood wrath. Blood wrath is this temporary mental condition in which an animal, usually a badger, undergoes in the battlefield, where all they have sight of is killing their enemies. It's a way of introducing a little moral grayness into this series where there's pretty much clear-cut good characters and bad characters, where these badger heroes become murdering machines in the heat of battle, albeit they still only kill bad guys. Another thing I get to appreciate by reading these books in order is that with his first several villains, each villain in the series gets an adjective. Their adjective helps show us how we should view them as a unique character and not just as the generic baddie that the good characters fight down. In the first Redwall book, we get Clooney the Scourge. A scourge can mean a weapon, like Clooney's whip tail, and it also means a person or thing that causes great trouble or suffering. And what makes Clooney unique as a villain is that he's this character who animals talk about in scary stories, but then he turns up at Redwall in the flesh and they realize, oh no, this evil is very real. So in book 2, the villain Sarmina is of the Thousand Eyes, someone who wants all-encompassing political power. The third villain is Slagar the Cruel. You know, unlike Sarmina, he doesn't have a regal ambition and he's not a legendary villain like Clooney. Rather, he's someone who feels like a lot of cruelty has been thrust upon him, and his mission is just to throw cruelty back on the world. And then finally, we get to the villain of this book. This guy here, though, as much as I like this illustration, I don't think it's accurate to the book's description of him. It's Gabool, and he is Gabool the Wild. So unlike our last three villains, Gabool's story does not start with a plan to terrorize good creatures. Instead, he's a paranoid tyrant of the pirate world, and his real mission is to kill all the other pirates who threaten him or he perceives as threatening his power. His wildness even leaves his best friend Greypatch to just abandon him. Greypatch figures it's better to retreat and risk Gabool's revenge and end this years-long friendship than to stay by this self-destructive pirate king. I also feel like there's an important political allegory. Often our understanding of the morality of governments is simplified down to, are the governments democratic or are they dictatorships? Now, of course, I am grateful that I do not live in a dictatorship. But that said, the reality of dictatorships is not necessarily that the tyrant is just always going around killing random people. I mean, some dictatorships, sure, Then quite a few of them, a lot of the political oppression only happens within the political class, right? Again, it's Gabul killing all the other pirates while not even processing that Mariel exists. Often the real dangers in society is not individual strong leaders, but policies that hurt us in various ways. Policies on economics, on war, the environment, etc. That may be a deeper political allegory than most, including Brian Jakes, would probably read into his book. But that's certainly something that comes out with how we developed Gabul as a character. Now, Gabul is the piece, other than the detail of how well the characters who are written, that really sets Mariel of Redwall apart as a book. The fact that Gabul sort of just awkwardly waits at his palace, not really paying attention to the good characters at all, does create a unique piece in the story, whereas usually you have much more interaction between the villains and the heroes. My one criticism with the way Gabul is written is in the previous books, it was really important that the characters were animals. So Sarmina was the dictator because she was a cat, and the woodland creatures were led by a mouse. Clooney led this swarm of rats. It, plays into the imagery of, rats infesting towns. And Slagger was a trickster, consistent with the imagery of a fox. Gabul, to me, he doesn't have any rat-like traits. The only reason he's a rat is that previously in the series it had established there was a whole culture of rat pirates. But if Jakes wanted to play more naturally to anthropomorphism with this creature that he describes as gigantic, as having a big beard, of just lashing out fiercely at all around him. I don't know, maybe I would have made him a wolf. If you were to really play to the maritime theme, maybe you could have found a way to make him a shark. I don't know. So I think the one weakness with Gabul is that he's a rat for no reason. And I think it's a shame because the selling point for these books in part is the covers, how cool these images of fighting anthropomorphic animals look. But I feel like one of the weaknesses of the series is lots of the time Brian Jakes doesn't do enough with the fact that his characters are animals. Beyond that, I stand by what I said in my previous video on the book, Matameo. Redwall books can start really strong and unique, but then kind of merge together and become similar. So as I was saying, I liked it how at the beginning of this book, each character had a more detailed personality than we'd seen before. Old Mouse Simeon, for instance, is really shaped by his blindness. The other characters kind of mysticize his blindness. They see him as having all these wise, mystical insights, and he's like, no, I don't really have them. Then you have Melis the Badger. I really liked her as a character. This caught me off guard because I remembered her name from when I was a kid, and I remembered her as just being the same character as Constance, but she's not at all. So on the one hand, in her sort of day-to-day work as the Badger mother, she's actually a lot gruffer than Constance. She's constantly giving the little ones baths. That's another great part of this story. There are 3 little ones who are pretty major characters in it: Bag, Run, and Grub, like just as comic relief, but they're great. But anyway, Melis is constantly mad at these little ones, but it's a ferocious, loving kind of way. And so while she's more ferocious than Constance in her day-to-day life, she's also not the warrior in battle that Constance is. For the most part, Melis is not involved in the combat in this story. I also mentioned in my review of Matameo that book was unique amongst Redwall books because its hero was a child. Now, I take that back, but only a little. Matameo is still unique in its portrayal of a realistic childhood. You have this kid who has parents, and he's not always impressing his parents, and he spends the whole book actually written as a kid. But what surprised me with Mariel of Redwall is that Jakes does this weird thing where his heroes are written vaguely childlike at the beginning and suddenly become adult-like when things get serious. Now, again, this could just be because they are mice and mice grow up fast, but more likely it's one of these cheap things that you get to do in storytelling. The most famous example of this is SpongeBob SquarePants, how he lives on his own and he has a job, but a lot of the ways he interacts with the world are not as an adult, but as a child. And we see that with our 3 central characters, Mariel, Dandin, and Saxtus. They're children when it's convenient and adults when it's convenient. So like with those secondary characters who I thought were written better than past characters in the Redwall series, I also liked the early writing of Dandin, Mariel, and Saxtus. They're all given very crisp introductions. So Mariel, who is based on Brian Jakes' granddaughter Jade, has this great, unique backstory. She loses her memory when Gabul the Wild throws her over a ship at sea. And so she wakes up and she doesn't know much, but she knows she has to survive. And she takes up a piece of rope and she uses it to defend herself. And this rope simultaneously becomes her weapon and her teddy bear. She calls it her goal whacker. And so while all the other Redwall heroes want to use swords or bows and arrows, she's like, no, thanks. I'm going to go and battle with my little piece of rope. And she's stubborn about it and she pulls it off. Dandin, meanwhile, is a troublemaker. And this is no surprise because he's said to be the descendant of the notorious Gonf, the mouse thief, the best friend of Martin the Warrior. And Dandin's uniqueness as a character comes out through the fact that he likes to just play around with his friend Saxtus, and he's, unlike Saxtus, not a good student in school, except when it comes time for Redwall military history. When he's asked questions about Martin the Warrior and his historic battles, suddenly Dandin becomes the nerd. And finally, there's Saxtus. He's shy and reserved. He's afraid to sing and likes reciting poems. So this book is split into two subplots. The A plot follows Mariel going out on a quest to seek vengeance and kill Gabul the Wild. She's accompanied by Dandin, who was given the sword of Martin the Warrior by Simeon. We have Tarquin the Hare and a hedgehog named Dury, who also tag along. As for Gabul, again, he's not really thinking that there's any possibility anyone is coming after him seeking revenge. He's only worried about his sort of inner war with the other rats, including his betrayal by Greypatch. Now, in a series with less rigid rules, there's a lot Jakes could have done with this character of Gabul's former first mate Greypatch. Greypatch could represent the idea of the more honorable pirate. And to a limited degree, Jakes does that. Greypatch is portrayed at least as a rational leader of his band of villains. I mean, he does plenty of brutal things, but he's never unfair by Vermin standards. Unless anyone is like out what route trying to overthrow them, he doesn't hurt anyone who's working for them. He mostly works in the interests of his own men. But at the same time, Jakes doesn't want to experiment too much with the idea of Greypatch being a gray character. Just like in Matameo, there has to be this B plot where there's a secondary villain who tries to take over Redwall Abbey, and that is exactly what Greypatch does. Now, a couple of unique moments come from the interaction with Greypatch trying to take over Redwall Abbey. Firstly, Jakes continues to develop Saxtus as a character. So when the rats first show up, Saxtus throws a spear, presumably just to assert himself, but he actually manages to kill a rat. And he breaks down crying when he sees the spear go through the rat and the rat just die. And Flag, one of the more war-minded creatures at Redwall, gives Saxtus a quick talking to about how, in war, it's kill or be killed, mate. And so Saxtus instantly jumps up, stops crying, and starts participating in the war again. And that's kind of how emotions have been handled in Brian Jakes' books up until now. Like when a character dies, people are just like, snap out of it. They want you to get back in the fight. But that's not exactly. A few chapters later, Saxtus is again exposed to the killing of an enemy. This time he doesn't do it. He watches another character, Colonel Clary, kill a rat. And Saxtus has the exact same reaction. He's absolutely shocked. He's like, you killed a creature, even though by this point he's now been participating in several days of battle. The implication in this scene is that Saxtus's first reaction to the death was not naive. It's not something he can just unlearn, even if the dominant ethic of the Redwall universe is, yeah, fight the bad creatures at any cost. I feel like what this Saxtus broadly stands for is that in wartime, it's very hard to stand up to the dominant position that you have to kill or be killed, or in the words of George W. Bush, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Saxtus doesn't believe that. Now, unfortunately, all his friends believe that, and it's a stressful time. There's no time for trying like radical pacifist solutions to dealing with evil sea rats. But on some level, that pacifism is a part of who Saxtus is. And that's why he goes on to have a very different story arc than Dandin and Mariel. Now, the other interesting dynamic with the Greypatch invasion of Redwall is that Greypatch and his pirates have slaves. So again, this is a choice that Brian Jakes, I think, makes so that he doesn't get too bogged down in the idea of Greypatch being a morally great character. No, Greypatch is another tyrant like Gabul. He even has slaves. But when the pirates do attack Redwall, they have their slaves with them. And this presents a moral dilemma for the Redwallers. The Abbey warriors, like Flag the Otter and Roofbrush the Squirrel, know that they have to start defending the abbey right away, to start flinging their rocks and their spears. But the more motherly Melis the badger points out an ethical problem. You can't just throw weapons and arrows at the rats when they have slaves walking alongside them. This is a moral problem the abbey creatures don't really know what to do with until they manage to get the support of 3 hares from the famous Long Patrol: Colonel Clary, Brigadier Time, and Honorable Rosie. The hares have the skills not just to defend the abbey, but to engage in more active missions against the sea rats. And so the hares start this plan to free the slaves. Now, at first, the Redwallers are kind of disappointed because I think there are something like 16 or 18 slaves, and the hares just come back with 2 of them. And they're like, well, look, even for us, this isn't easy. These slaves are in chains. They're not going to run really fast. We're not going to be able to protect more than 2 of them at a time. And eventually it becomes clear, as the rats start to up their security, the only way, even for these really skilled hares, to free the slaves is to go into direct combat with the rats. And skilled as these hares are, direct combat means, spoiler alert, giving up their lives. The death of the hares is a poignant moment in Redwall history. It's a reminder of how difficult it is to truly bring justice to the world when your enemies have weapons. Sure, the Redwallers have been brave in defending their own fortress, but they have a fortress. It takes a truly remarkable and brave and selfless person to actually go out into the world and fight what seems like a hopeless battle in the name of social justice. The Redwallers weren't up to it. It took these hares, and try as they may, the hares weren't even good enough. Now, back to the main plot, Mariel and Dandin, et cetera, versus Gabool. I would say the message of that part of the book almost seems to be about the futility of seeking revenge. All the while Mariel's hatred for Gabool is pooling up, Gabool again is just rotting away in his palace, being self-destructive. Right before Gabool is ultimately confronted, about 7 different heroes swear to get their revenge on him. But none of them really get their revenge because, spoiler, Gabool is killed by his own pet scorpion, or his own prisoner scorpion. One character reassures the others who are feeling bad about not getting their revenge. Now, evil destroys evil, while good triumphs. Now, this motif is pretty much recycled from the previous book, Matameo, where we also had several good characters vowing to get revenge before the villain sort of is undone by internal processes. That said, it's important that in Mariel, this message is explicitly laid out and not just played out as an accident. The motive of revenge may be an important driver for heroes in a story, but at the same time, when they actually get revenge, they start to feel a bit less likable, a bit less relatable, a bit less like heroes. That's why for the Badgers, Brian Jacques has to invent this disease called blood wrath. Getting revenge kind of takes away your humanity. And the way he maintains the relatability and humanity of his mice characters is minimizing their ability to ever actually just straight up get revenge. Now, is Mariel of Redwall an anti-revenge book? Not really. Brian Jacques probably realized it would be hard to keep telling medieval stories without saving revenge as a motivation for his heroes. Also, while Gabool is not taken out by vengeance, spoiler alert, Grey Patch is. And honestly, Grey Patches is one of the weirder deaths in the series for me because he's killed by a very minor character who only shows up towards the end of the book. And while the same thing happened in Matameo, where an eagle comes to save the abbey from invading ravens and crows, this time the savior is just some random squirrel. And all I can imagine is because Brian Jacques clearly had this talent for really complex world building, and he probably kept notebooks and notebooks of character names and their histories. All I imagine is this is a character he wrote a lot about in his notebooks and became very alive in his head. And he hadn't quite processed the fact that he'd barely actually given this character much time in his book. And thus, this didn't really feel like a compelling arc. So overall, a lot of things to like about Mariel of Redwall, particularly the character development. Again, the book is stronger at the beginning than it is in the second and third acts, but it continues to have its moments. And I would also recommend this book if you're only reading part of the series because it's one of the few with a true sequel. That book is The Bellmaker, which is going to reintroduce some of these characters. So I look forward to reading that when it comes along. But the next book in the series by publication order is a book set in a different generation called Salamander Strong. So I'm looking forward to reading that. Enjoy Redwall, my friends. See you next time.